Good day everyone. In this video, I will be going to discuss the chapter 5 of the book entitled Data Collection Techniques. In this chapter, we'll deal with three frequently used data collection techniques: the questionnaire, the interview, and observation. But before I begin the discussion, let me first introduce myself. I am Christina Narca, studying Bachelor of Library and Information Science. Discuss the questionnaire or the pre-questionnaire planning. The planning that should precede the design of questionnaire is not that different from the planning that should go into the early development of a research study. Here are some examples of pre-questionnaire planning. Here are the major steps and of emphasizing decisions that should be made before the data collection instrument is selected or designed. Step 1. Define the problem and purpose. Step 2. Consider previous related research, the advice of experts, and so on. Step 3. Hypothesize a solution to the problem, or at least identify research questions, the answers to which will shed some light on the problem. Step 4. Identify the information needed to test the hypothesis. In this step should include deciding which aspects of the problem will be considered in planning ahead to the presentation and analysis of the data. Step 5. Identify the potential respondents or subjects. Practical questions should be asked at this time, such as: are the potential respondents accessible? Are they likely to respond? Step 6. Select the best or most appropriate technique for collecting the necessary data. It is heard that the researcher should consider the relevant advantages and disadvantages of the questionnaire, interview, observation, and other techniques in relation to the more general methodology to be used. Advantages of the questionnaire. The questionnaire, which the American Heritage Dictionary of English Language defines as a form containing a set of questions, especially one addressed to a statistically significant number of subjects, as a way of gathering information from a survey. Here are some advantages of the questionnaire. First, the questionnaire, especially the mail, email, and web-based questionnaire, tends to encourage frank answers. The characteristics of the questionnaire that help to produce frank answer also eliminate interviewer bias. Another way of stating the second advantage is that the fixed format of the questionnaire tends to eliminate variation in the questioning process. The manner in which mail questionnaire is distributed and responded to also allows it to be completed within limits at the leisure of the participants. Questionnaires can be constructed so that quantitative data are relatively easy to collect and analyze. Questionnaire can facilitate the collection of large amounts of data in a relatively short period of time. Questionnaires are usually relatively inexpensive to administer. Disadvantages of questionnaires. While the advantages of the questionnaires seem to outweigh the disadvantages, there are several of the latter that should be noted. 1. Use of the mail questionnaire eliminates personal contact between the researcher and the respondent. 2. The mail questionnaire does not permit the respondent to qualify answers to ambiguous questions, or at least makes it more difficult. Studies have shown that persons who are highly opinionated regarding the subject of a questionnaire are more likely than others to be motivated enough to complete and return it. 4. Questionnaires may be more difficult for uneducated participants to complete, again possibly resulting in a biased return. Fifth, in general, there simply seems to be a resistance to male questionnaires. In the extreme case, this can result in some participants attempting to sabotage a survey by purposefully responding incorrectly to some questionnaire items. 6. Non-response rates are relatively high for mail, email, and web-based questionnaires, although web-based surveys often first use another survey method to recruit participants. And lastly, if the questionnaire is distributed electronically, it will reach only those who have access to and are comfortable using email and web technology. Constructing the questionnaire. Proper construction of the questionnaire is essential to its success. In general, the researcher must consider his or her information needs and the characteristics of the participants. Type of question according to information needed. In selecting or writing specific types of questions, the researcher must first consider what kind of data he or she needs. First, factual questions. Questions used to ascertain such things as their respondents' age, gender, and so on. 2. Opinion and attitude questions. Questions intended to determine a person's ideas, inclinations, prejudice, convictions, and so on. 3. Information questions. Questions designed to measure the respondent's knowledge about some topic. 4. Standards of action questions. Questions used to determine how respondents would act in certain circumstances. 5th, self-perception questions. Questions quite similar to attitude questions, but restricted to one's opinions about himself or herself. 6. Questions about actual past or present behavior. Questions that potentially fall within some of the categories of questions already identified, but tend to be narrower in that they focus on behavior. 7. Projective questions. Questions that allow respondents to answer questions indirectly by imposing their personal beliefs, attitudes, and so on onto others. Types of question according to form. In selecting or designing questionnaire items, the researcher must consider the question format that will be best obtain the information desired. The researcher must decide which response format will be the easiest for the respondent while still producing adequate, definite, and uniform answers. There are two basic types of questions. First, the open-ended questions, also known as unstructured questions. It is designed to permit free responses from participants rather than ones limited to specific alternatives. Next is the fixed response questions, or also known as structured questions. It is limit the responses of the participants to stated alternatives. It is answerable by yes or no. Example of open-ended question. What do you think about the library? Which library services do you value the most? 3. I typically use the library in order to. Example of text response or pre-coded questionnaire. Do you have a current library card? Yes or no? Or always remember that fixed response is answerable by yes or no. Structured questions come in a variety of specific formats. A checklist, each item of which requires a response. Number 2, a checklist of items, one or more of which represents the best answer. Number 3, a checklist of items with subdivisions or categories. 4, a checklist of bracket or group response. And 5th, fill in the blank. Scaled responses. A variety of questions utilize scales of one type or another in order to obtain responses. One kind of scale is the rating scale. Specific rating scales with examples. Number 1, an itemized rating or specific category scale. Number 2, a graphic rating scale, or this too is a scale designed to collect ordinal level data. But unlike the specific category scale, the graphic scale allows the respondent to check anywhere along a continuum. Number 3, a rank order or comparative rating scale. Multiple item scales can be categorized as differential, summated, and cumulative. First, let's discuss the differential scale. It is a Thurstone type scale, utilizes a series of statements or items with equidistances between them. Here are the examples. Is the summative scales. Only items that are favorable or unfavorable to the attitude of interest are used, or unless a no opinion type of response is included. Here are the examples. Last is the specialized scale. Share some of the summative scales is the semantic differential scales. Here is the example. Scaled responses. A variety of questions utilize scales of one type or another in order to obtain responses. One kind of scale is the rating scale. Question wording. The way in which the contents of questionnaire items are worded can also affect their validity and reliability. Consider the following two questions. Do you think the U.S. should forbid public speeches against democracy? Or do you think the U.S. should not allow public speeches against democracy? Sequences of questionnaires item. Even the sequencing of questions can influence how they are answered. Changes in questions order can produce context errors, resulting in substantial differences in responses to the same question. Sources of error. Before continuing with the outline of the procedures for developing a questionnaire, it may be worthwhile to consider some of the type of questionnaire error not already discussed. Some of the more common types of error or bias, not all of which are limited to questionnaires, are the following. Number 1. researcher bias in essence. This bias results the researchers unconsciously developing the questionnaire in a manner that will increase the likelihood of obtaining the desired results. Number two, sponsorship bias. This bias results from the researcher's hopefully unconscious attempt to produce research results that will please the outside agency funding the research. Number three, imperfections of design. Weaknesses in the design of the questionnaire can result in bias or inaccurate responses. Number four, respondent interpretations. Varying interpretations of the facts and date and key terms by the respondent also can result in accurate answers. 5. Time lapse. It has been found that answers to the same question tend to vary over time even when not directly affected by the passage of time. 6. Circumstances. A variety of factors such as carelessness and mood of the respondent, ambiguous questions, unthinking answers, and general resistance to questionnaires can produce inaccurate responses. And number 7, response bias. Error can result from the response rate being low and the final sample ends up less representative than originally conceived. And last but not the least, the reactive insight. There is a growing concern that as subjects participate in surveys over time, especially in surveys dealing with sensitive topics, they may begin to rethink their lives, attitudes, and so on. Preparing the first draft. The researcher must decide on the sequence of questions that best serves his or her purpose. And in preparing the first draft of the questionnaire, the researcher may decide that some questions are of such a nature that respondents are unlikely to answer them accurately or honestly. Evaluating the questionnaire. Once the first draft of the questionnaire has been completed, and before it is actually pretested, it is a good idea to get one or more experts' opinion of the questionnaire. A person who is expert in research methodology can help to catch methodological weaknesses in instruments such as faulty scales, inadequate instructions, and so on. A person who is familiar with the topic of the questionnaire can help in assessing the face validity of the questions. And though they make sense, are they easy to understand? Do they ask what they are supposed to be asking? The pretest. After obtaining an informal evaluation of the questionnaire, it should be pretested fully. This pretest is sometimes referred to as a pilot study, although pilot study is actually more synonymous with exploratory study. A pretest gives the researcher an opportunity to identify questionnaire items that tend to be misunderstood by the participants, do not obtain the information that is needed, and so on. But in addition to testing the actual questionnaire items, the pretest should include interviews with some or all of the pretest participants or at least incorporate one or more open-ended questions, interviews, and or open-ended questions. All editing have been pretested. The questionnaire is ready for final editing before distribution. It is recommended that the title of the study or survey be placed at the top of the questionnaire. The organization will benefit from the employment of an outline format in lettering and numbering sections and questions. The questions on each page should be arranged so that there is adequate white space among them and in the margins. Adequate lines or spaces should be left for responding to open-ended questions. Cover letter. A cover letter should accompany the questionnaire. The basic purpose of the cover letter is to explain briefly the purpose of the study and to stress the importance of each person's responding. Distribution of the questionnaire. Three main methods of administering the survey questionnaire. The questionnaire can be self-administered, which means that the respondents are asked to complete the questionnaire themselves. Administered face-to-face to respondents by researchers, or administered to respondents via the telephone by interviewers. The self-administered questionnaire can be mailed or electronically transmitted via email or the web. Questionnaire. Unless the questionnaire is designed as a self-mailer or is to be faxed or emailed back to the researcher, it should be accompanied by a self-addressed, stamped, return envelope. Again, almost anything that will help to encourage responses is worth doing in deciding when to mail the questionnaire. The researcher should take into account common vacation periods and other such factors that may affect how quickly persons are likely to respond. Apparently, most librarians prefer to receive work-related questionnaires at the office rather than home. Most researchers utilizing a mail or email or web-based questionnaire should expect to have to conduct one or more follow-up mailings in order to reach an adequate response rate. The researcher must first decide how long to wait before distributing a follow-up mailing. This decision will depend upon how long the participants were given to respond to the first mailing. The response period should be long enough to avoid rushing the participants, but short enough that they do not forget about the question. 1 to 2 weeks is usually considered to be a reasonable period of time. A second decision relating to the follow-up is whether another copy of the questionnaire should be included with the reminder letter. Once again, any device that will help to increase the number of responses should be considered. Electronic questionnaire. According to Baker, a web survey is typically a survey in which the questionnaire is formatted with HTML and stored on a web server. Respondents are invited to a URL and required to log in or authenticate in some way. Questions are presented via the respondent's web browser, and responses are examined by the survey software and stored on the web server. Web surveys can be especially useful for surveying populations for which there is no list and for exploratory research, and they tend to enjoy quicker response times than do paper surveys and take less time to administer. Email and web-based surveys can be designed to automate skip patterns and automatically validate answers. The two popular software programs for web surveys are SurveyMonkey.com and Zoomerang. Such services allow the researcher to design the web questionnaire, collect responses, and analyze the results. With Zoomerang, one can design a questionnaire using over 100 templates or create his or her own. A third program, the Survey System, offers both web survey software and full-service hosting. And it also provides a list of guidelines specifically for developing an electronic questionnaire. The interview and how to develop the interview. The basic steps in developing a standardized or structured interview are not that different from those for developing most other kind of survey studies. One of the first steps must be development of the list of questions to be asked, or the interview schedule. An additional step in the development of the interview involves the training of interviewers. Even if one is working with experienced interviewers, they need to become familiar with the researcher's particular questions. The same interviewer should be involved in the pretest as in the final interview. Conducting the personal interview. In conducting an interview, the interviewer should attempt to create a friendly, non-threatening atmosphere, much as one does with a cover letter. The interviewer should give a brief, casual introduction to the study, stress the importance of the person's participation, and assure anonymity or at least confidentiality when possible. The interviewer should answer all the legitimate questions about the nature of the study and produce appropriate credentials upon request. He or she should be prepared to respond to such questions as: how did you happen to pick me? Who gave you my name? Why don't you go next door? Disadvantages of the interview. As with other research methods and techniques, bias presents a real threat to the validity of interviews. Particularly critical is the bias that may be introduced by the interviewer. Rapport and interpersonal relationships are more difficult to develop in an online interview than in person. The interview can be quite expensive in terms of travel and long-distance telephone calls. Structured questions come in a variety of specific formats. A checklist, each item of which requires a response. Number 2, a checklist of items, one or more of which represents the best answer. Number 3, a checklist of items with subdivisions or categories. 4, a checklist of bracket or group response. And 5th, fill in the blank. Focus group interviews. In contrast to what has been covered thus far, there are less structured interview techniques available to the researcher. The unstructured interview is more flexible than the structured one and most appropriate in the early stages of an investigation in a qualitative studies. Examples of less structured interviews include the focused group, the clinical interview or personal history, and the non-directive interview. The focus group is a group interview designed to explore in depth the feelings and beliefs people hold to learn how these feelings shape over behavior. The interview and how to develop the interview. The basic steps in developing a standardized or structured interview are not that different from those for developing most other kind of survey studies. One of the first steps must be development of the list of questions to be asked, or the interview schedule. An additional step in the development of the interview involves the training of interviewers. Even if one is working with experienced interviewers, they need to become familiar with the researcher's particular questions. The same interviewer should be involved in the pretest as in the final interview. Cover letter. A cover letter should accompany the questionnaire. The basic purpose of the cover letter is to explain briefly the purpose of the study and to stress the importance of each person's responding. Advantages of observational research. As the data collection technique, observation has several important advantages, including the following. One, the use of observation makes it possible to record behavior as it occurs. Two, observation allows one to compare what people actually did with what they said they did. Third, observational techniques can identify behavior, actions, and so on that people may not think to report because they seem unimportant or irrelevant. Fourth, with observational techniques, a researcher can study subjects who are unable to give verbal reports. And fifth, the use of observation is generally independent of the subject's willingness to participate. Limitations of observational research. Observational techniques do suffer from a few limitations. Some of the more important ones are as follows. 1. It is not always possible to anticipate a spontaneous event and thus be prepared to observe it. Some of the most critical activity at the library's online catalog, for example, may take place when no one is there to observe. 2. The duration of an event affects the feasibility of observing it. Third, some types of behavior are obviously too private or personal in nature to be observed. Fourth, it is generally somewhat more difficult to quantify observational data than other kinds. Behavior simply cannot always be broken down into net categories. Unstructured observation. There are two basic types of observation: the unstructured observation and structured observation. Unstructured observation sometimes equated with participant observation, but its most important characteristic reflects the fact that the researcher does not have predetermined sets of categories of behavior to use. Therefore, it is a relatively flexible technique and is particularly useful in exploratory research. In planning unstructured observational research, one must take into account that participant or subject, the setting, the purpose of the subjects being where they are, the type of behavior to be observed, and the frequency and duration of the behavior. In other words, the researcher must be as well prepared as possible to record accurately the upcoming behavior without going so far. The next is the structured observation. Structured observation is more formal technique often used in quantitative studies in order to provide systematic description or to test causal hypotheses. Steps that can be taken to increase the accuracy of unstructured observation. First, using two or more observational techniques such as sound and visual recordings, and then comparing results. Second, Having two or more people observe the same behavior with the same technique and then comparing the results. Third, being careful to distinguish between actual behavior and perceptions or interpretations of the behavior when taking notes. Fourth, avoiding becoming involved in the activity being observed. And fifth, being careful not to take behavior for granted. Six, obtaining reactions from the participant regarding the accuracy of the observation can be useful in situations where the subjects are fully aware of the rule of the cover letter. A cover letter should accompany the questionnaire. The basic purpose of the cover letter is to explain briefly the purpose of the study and to stress the importance of each person's responding. Testing. Usability testing is evaluating usability involves measuring the degree to which a user can successfully learn and use a system or service. Usability testing is the observation and analysis of users' behavior while they interact with system or prototype. All, thank you very much. Bye bye.